In my Mark course on a couple of videos, I've made the point that in the Gospel of Mark, halfway through in chapter 8, when Peter, who's really the most prominent of the 12 in the Gospel of Mark, he finally confesses Jesus as the Christ. Remember the scene? It's up north in Caesarea Philippi, way to the north of the country. I always take tour groups all the way up to that area. And Jesus asks in the scene that Mark gives us, "Who do men say that I am?" And the disciples answer, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist and one of the prophets," and so forth. I want to look at that in this video with you in some detail on the details. But the upshot that I have stressed is that Peter's confession, "Who do you say?" and he says, "You are the Christ," was actually a false confession. And I think in one of them I even said, because I was interviewed a lot about the course, I think I might have said it was satanic. And that's what I want to talk about, was Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ in the Gospel of Mark. Was it false? Was it satanic? Am I just using hyperbole? Jesus does use hyperbole, as you know, in the Gospels, like, if you want to follow me, you got to hate your father, mother, brother, and so forth. And people always try to lose the hyperbole, and they'll say things like, well, hate really means love less. And yet the language is very sharp. So when Jesus says to Peter, rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan," you have all these people lining up to tell you why that doesn't really mean that. And I just want to take a look at it. So I'm going to share the screen here. I just did a JPEG image of it so we could see it here. And I think I can, yeah, that's full screen. I haven't used Zoom in a while, but I think we can see it completely here. So here's the text and the passage. And if you see how this book is laid out, this is Throckmorton. I'll hold it up here. I've recommended Gospel Parallels, Throckmorton. And also this one, which is the American Bible Society, which has all four Gospels. But I'm used to Throckmorton, so I'm going to use that one here. And you can see here that you've got Mark in the middle. If you look over on this page on the left side as you're looking at it, you've got Mark in the middle, and then you've got Matthew and Luke. And this is the scene of the confession of Peter. Now, notice in this text, and you can read it for yourself, if you start with Mark, right here in the middle, and it says, "Who do men say that I am?" That's the question. And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." Now, for Mark, that's not a glory hallelujah confession. I'm going to go to Matthew and Luke in a minute, but keep reading Mark, keep reading the middle column. And he, that's Jesus, charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him and began to rebuke him. Notice the word rebuke. It's very sharp in Greek. If you were acting it out, it would be something like taking Jesus aside and going, "What are you thinking? No, I said you're the Christ," that kind of thing. I'm not trying to act it out for you. So notice he began, verse 31, he began to teach them And he also charged them in verse 30 to tell no one. This is Mark 8, verse 30. You can see it there. So that messianic secret that Mark works with throughout, that Matthew and Luke have no interest in at all. I mean, you know who Jesus is in Matthew and Luke because of the virgin birth stories right away. All kinds of miracles happening immediately. And so Mark is different. In Mark, nobody knows except the evil spirits, and you, the reader, know because of verse 1, the beginning of Jesus, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah. And some copies even add Son of God, whether that should be there or not. Now, if you keep on going in Mark, verse 33, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not on the side of God, but of men." So yes, the rebuke is because he's opposing the suffering servant idea. That's true. And I got all these comments on YouTube with people saying, why don't you read the verses that you skipped about his suffering? Well, I didn't skip them. I just didn't read the whole passage. But the idea that I'm working on here is that if Peter has an idea of what it is to be the Christ or the Messiah, and it comes up again and again in Mark, who will be first, who will be the greatest, who will be at the right and left hand, and so forth. And even in terms of the poor widow who gives all she has at the end of the Gospel of Mark, the disciples immediately after hearing about that talk about the beautiful buildings and so forth. So Mark always presents them as failing and not understanding, always without exception. Now look over at the left column in Matthew there, and you'll see that it reads pretty much the same. He embellishes it a little. Verse 14, and they said, some say John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. So he adds a little, but who do you say? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So you can see that Matthew, remember, Mark is Matthew's source, so he wants to take it and embellish it and expand it a bit. But notice the next verse. You're still going to get the rebuke and get behind me, Satan. That's going to come. But before that, you have verse 17. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. So suddenly, Matthew doesn't want it to be a false confession. So the people who are sending me all the objections and criticism, you clearly agree with Matthew. And yet, to have Mark as the source with no blessing of Peter and rebuking Peter for his misunderstanding, and then to imply that it wasn't a misunderstanding because flesh and blood has not revealed it to him, but the Father in heaven, then how could it possibly be satanic because it's coming from God and so forth? That is an interpolation that Matthew puts in. He wants to mitigate and soften the blow. You see what he's doing. Now look at Luke. Luke is really amazing. He's got an account that pretty well follows Mark in the opening. Who do you say that I am? You see verse 20. And Peter answered, the Christ of God. So not just, he at least adds God. And then look over to the other side, verse 21 in Luke, the third column. But he charged and commanded them to tell no one. And it doesn't say he began to teach them, because for Luke, this is not the beginning of that teaching about suffering. Son of man must suffer many things, be rejected by the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day raised. Now look what I wrote in my copy. Omit. This is the copy I used for teaching for years. Omit. He just takes it out. So this about Peter rebuking him and he rebuking Peter and saying he's not even on the side of God. So if Peter's not on the side of God because he's objecting, then the revelation of him as the Christ was not with understanding. That's actually my simple point. So I hope that helps just to put the actual picture up and so forth. And I'm going to stop the share and just say, if you haven't gotten the Mark course, I hope you will consider getting it. It's 7 lectures. It's got notes, study guides, maps, bibliography, take you through the entire book of Mark. You can read the book of Mark in a couple of hours, actually less than 2 hours, I think an hour and 15 minutes or so. And there are oral renditions of it on YouTube if you wanted to just listen. But if you study with me, I like you to look at the text. But I go through and show a lot of these things. And remember, the key is to let Mark be Mark. It's perfectly fine to let Matthew be Matthew and let Luke be Luke. But to notice those very distinct differences, even in this passage. Now, if it was just here, you could say, well, they really began to edit, Matthew adding this huge blessing of Peter, Luke taking out all the rebuke and so forth. But they do it consistently everywhere. Matthew is the glory, hallelujah, all power is given unto me, and so forth. And Luke is the forgiving, compassionate. Jesus forgives his enemies on the cross. He takes out, my God, why have you forsaken me, and so on. So this method of study, often called critical, I like to call careful. We're being careful. We're actually looking at what the text says. So I hope this is just a little taste of what some of the academic benefits are to looking carefully at these texts and reading them in that way, separately from one another. It's perfectly fine to compare them, of course, but you really do begin to see something emerge if you listen to the voice of Mark, and it's been utterly forgotten. It really has. So I hope this helps.